Well, you're sitting like everyone usually sits in the pews, right? Scattered and toward the back. Let us pray. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be with you this afternoon. Grateful to Mark, Yuda, and the other organizers of the music conference for inviting me to speak. Hi, freshmen. So timing issues require that we kind of link these two disparate audiences, the music scholars and the freshmen. And I'm going to sort of try my best to see if I can't say a little something to each of you. My invitation to speak at the music conference was presumably based on kind of general arts and faith interest, because I'm not an expert in music, much less a scholar in music, but I love music and I listen to it constantly. I have very strange taste, so I tend to like very, very early music and very, very modern music. And then there's like Brahms in the middle. So anyway, I don't know what that says about me. When I'm emotionally ready, I like to listen to serious singer-songwriter music. And when I'm working, I listen to the Chemical Brothers and other forms of electronica so I can just keep going. But wisely, I'm speaking not about music at all tonight. I don't know, I think I have a sort of self-destructive wish. I sat there in a beautiful chapel this morning with the sun streaming in and spoke to bright young people about tragedy. Now, this afternoon, I want to talk about a little thing called the history of consciousness. I don't know, something in me just sabotages my ability to just be a normal speaker and talk about normal stuff. If it's any consolation, I'm totally over my head with this topic. But isn't that where it's fun? Like if you're gonna just know it already and you're on top of it, it's, that's no fun to that. It's like, throw me in the deep end. Maybe with a life preserver, but let's just splash around in this craziness together. I hope that will work. I think everybody deserves an executive summary. You know how all those busy executives, they're not going to read the whole thing, so you have to write a little thing at the beginning. What's the executive summary? So the executive summary is, I'm going to show you a clip from a film that blew my mind, a film called Cave of Forgotten Dreams, about the discovery of some cave paintings in France very recently, the kind of most recent major discovery. It blew my mind. It made me think about the way we look at the world. It made me think about why we make art and how that art enables us to perhaps find a connection from earth to heaven. I'm going to talk a little bit about how over history, the way we've looked at consciousness changes, so that we tend to take for granted that people have lived for millennia, but once they became Homo sapiens, we all looked at the world the same. We just had different kind of vehicles. Some were like wagons and some were Maseratis, but the reality is that people haven't seen the world and their place in it the same way over history. It's changed. And if we just take for granted the way we perceive ourselves in relationship to the cosmos as just unchanging, we'll really miss out on the richness of our history and some of the puzzles and challenges of our history. So I'm going to talk a bit about the way consciousness changes from the time of those cave paintings to our time, and how some of what we lost between the cave paintings and now might possibly be restored through various forms, mostly through certain forms of worship and through certain forms of art making, try to bring the art full circle from the caves to present and back again. So there's the executive summary. I hope that the thread of that doesn't get totally lost in the talk. So I'm not going to say anything else to set up the clip now. It's 7 minutes. Believe me, it's worth it. I wanted it to be 7 minutes, partly so I didn't have to write 7 more minutes worth of stuff, but also because this is a revelation. Very few people have seen this film. Very few people have seen these caves, which are literally twice as old as the oldest cave previously discovered. And the artwork here is beautiful. And I think it's worth just trying to immerse. We're talking about consciousness in this talk. Just try to take these images in and try to allow yourself to flow into a different consciousness, a different time period. So it's just a single clip, and then I'll talk afterwards. So hit it, folks. Thank you. you notice the part where you started to hear a heartbeat? I just thought that was very clever of the director of the soundtrack to kind of indicate our presence in this place. So here we go. In 1994, 3 spelunkers were looking for undiscovered caves in the Ardèche region of southeastern France. The region is named after the Ardèche River, which has cut through limestone for millennia and created hundreds of caves. On a summer weekend expedition, they came across a place in a cliff wall where they sensed a draft of warm air near a pile of rubble. They dug around it, but soon lost interest. Then, in December, they returned to the same place and felt a stronger draft. They began digging in earnest and entered a vast cave complex filled with dozens of cave bear skulls, a species that has been extinct for 12,000 years, and hundreds of prehistoric drawings on the walls, drawings of such breathtaking beauty that they knew they had made a major discovery. 2 of the spelunkers chose to name the cave after the third, Jean-Marie Chauvet, who had been exploring the region for 3 decades. Like many people, I first learned about Chauvet Cave through the Werner Herzog documentary Cave of Forgotten Dreams, from which our clip came. It's a typical Herzog film, personal and eccentric, marked by moments of insight and marred by a number of strange non sequiturs. But it may be the best footage of this cave the world is likely to ever see, given the French government's decision to refuse public access to it. This is because the other caves that have been opened, all the human bodies that came in with their bacteria and body oils and everything, have created an environment where it started to degenerate the cave paintings. But when I first saw the handheld camera lights illuminate the first image on that wall, I found myself transfixed. Several things make Chauvet stand out among prehistoric cave sites. For one thing, the majority of the animals depicted are not those that would have been hunted for food, such as aurochs and mammoths. Rather, there are dozens of depictions of major predators, like cave bears, woolly rhinoceros, cave lions, panthers, and cave hyenas. But what really caused me to hold my breath was that this cave art was unmistakably art. These charcoal drawings are not mere stick figures. They employ shading and smudging that model 3 dimensions and perspective. One of the bison is rendered not in profile, but turned toward the viewer, looking out from under a thick matting of fur. A cave bear's bulk and musculature is suggested by the alternating use of thick and thin lines. An owl, traced by a finger in clay, has its head swiveled 180 degrees, looking at us over his folded wings. A rhinoceros is depicted almost in cubist fashion, with multiple legs and a series of echoed horns, capturing movement in a single image. Herzog says that depiction of the multiple legs and horns was the first film, trying to capture motion in a still format. One of the creatures in the panel of horses is open-mouthed, as if braying loudly. A pride of lions crouches low to the ground as they hunt unsuspecting bison. Several of the drawings deliberately use the shape of the wall to emphasize the contours of what they are portraying. The other distinctive about Chauvet, though there's been some debate, scientists now generally believe that it may be over 30,000 years old, nearly twice as old as the caves at Lascaux and Altamira. What makes all this so compelling to me is that Chauvet runs counter to the received wisdom. Since the Enlightenment, since the rise of modern science and scientism, we've been told by anthropologists that art by early humans was completely utilitarian in purpose. Cave art, they said, was part of a shamanic ritual in which the pictures of the animals enabled the hunters to gain power over the animals' spirits and thus kill them more effectively. The same goes for the religious dimension of Paleolithic humanity, which is seen as little more than manipulation of the environment. When an anthropologist in Cave of Forgotten Dreams is asked, what constitutes our humanness? All he can say is the capacity for adaptation. Think about that for a moment. What is adaptation but a purely functional concept? It knows nothing of meaning or purpose. It merely drifts, changing randomly with circumstances. So the operative word in the received wisdom about this kind of art has always been power. Power over those animal spirits. Power over the environment. Ironically, this seems to project, in the psychological sense of projection, to project the ideology of modern scientism, Francis Bacon's conviction that science involves power over nature, on top of rich, complex, ancient phenomena that don't deserve that kind of treatment. It's hard to imagine anything less in tune with the scientific enterprise than purely projecting emotionally your own prejudices onto the evidence. But this happens all the time. When I gaze at the drawings on the walls of Chauvet, when I see male and female cave lions, predators who are not likely to become Paleolithic man's next meal, when I see these lions shown gently but casually brushing up against one another, all I can see is love. Love between these creatures and the love of the artist for what he's so carefully observed. Where is the utility in this careful observation? To depict these beasts so minutely is to have little to do with power and control. The act is gratuitous and free. Welling up from within this love, I see wonder, awe, praise, celebration. Art that generates life rather than seeking to take life away. It is as if the artist sense in these beasts beings who are similar to themselves and yet mysteriously different. Strange and enchanting cousins in the order of creation. They become emblems of beauty, strength, intimacy, speed, passion. And in becoming emblems, they echo the same qualities in their human counterparts. If, as the saying goes, love is the opposite of power, then the underlying motive behind art, the recreation of the world, is something closer to Lewis Hyde's notion of art as gift, offering, sacrifice. When Jean-Marie Chauvet and his friends entered the cave for the first time, they came upon a block of stone that had fallen from the roof, and on that stone was the skull of a cave bear pointed toward them. What they came upon was an altar. I would venture to say that the heart of our humanness is not merely the capacity for adaptation, but the ability to perceive and make meaning, to experience the world as an altar upon which the divine enters flesh. From the proverbial dawn of time, human beings have felt the need to withdraw from the bright glare of sunlight and enter into a dark space where we can reimagine the world, drawing it on cave walls and embedding it in stained glass, where it can be contemplated by torchlight and candlelight. This is a profoundly paradoxical action, a retreat from the immediacy of life in order to recreate it as meaning and as ritual. Here I think of the moving statement made by the great Swedish filmmaker, Ingmar Bergman. I'm going to quote it at some length because I think it makes an important point and prepares for the final section of my paper. This is Bergman, the great film director, maker of The Seventh Seal and many, many other films. He writes, "There is an old story of how the cathedral of Chartres was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. Then thousands of people came from all points of the compass, like a giant procession of ants, and together they began to rebuild the cathedral on its old site. They worked until the building was completed. Master builders, artists, laborers, clowns, noblemen, priests, burghers. But they all remained anonymous, and no one knows to this day who built the cathedral of Chartres." And this is continuing with Bergman. "Regardless of my own beliefs," and he was known, by the way, as not a traditional religious believer, "regardless of my own beliefs and my own doubts, which are unimportant in this connection, it is my opinion that art lost its basic creative drive the moment it was separated from worship. It severed an umbilical cord and now lives its own sterile life, generating and degenerating itself. In former days, the artist remained unknown, and his work was to the glory of God. He lived and died without being any more or less important than other artisans. Eternal values, immortality, and masterpiece were terms not applicable in his case. The ability to create was a gift. In such a world flourished invulnerable assurance and natural humility." And now one more paragraph from Bergman. "Today, the individual has become the highest form and the greatest bane of artistic creation. The smallest wound or pain of the ego is examined under a microscope as if it were of eternal importance. The artist considers his isolation, his subjectivity, his individualism almost holy. Thus we finally gather in one large pen where we stand and bleat about our loneliness without listening to each other and without realizing that we are smothering each other to death. The individualists stare into each other's eyes and yet deny the existence of the other. We walk in circles, so limited by our own anxieties that we can no longer distinguish between true and false, between the gangster's whim and the purest idea." I love that quote. It's killer good. For the moment, I want to simply stick with Bergman's point about the relationship between art and worship. An experience in which human beings can be deeply expressive and yet not subjective, supremely creative and yet anonymous. To truly encounter what is to be found at Chauvet, even vicariously through film and photographs, is to suddenly realize that words like art and religion are clumsy, ham-fisted abstractions that violate something whole and ultimately inviolable. It also tends to make the word primitive, with all of its connotations that have grown up around it over the centuries, seem almost laughable, if not obscene. In other words, thinking of the makers of this art as primitives. When you see that, can you really say primitive in your mind and mean it with the kind of pejorative use that we so casually do when we talk about early Homo sapiens? I can't, not after seeing that. One of the researchers interviewed in Cave of Forgotten Dreams seems to understand this. In order to understand Chauvet, he says, you must go outside of this particular cave to other ancient cultures, including the surviving remnants of ancient cultures still today on this planet. He then relates the story of an ethnographer who accompanied an Australian Aborigine on an expedition to some very old rock paintings. The paintings had decayed because no one had continued the tradition of touching them up. Most of the Aborigines were going to the big cities to get work. This grieved the older Aborigine, so he decided that he would touch up the pictographs with fresh paint. As the ethnographer watched him work, He asked the sort of question that springs naturally to any modern mind. Why are you painting? The Aborigine answered simply, I am not painting. Now, even for a relatively sympathetic observer, there's something mind-boggling, if not downright irritating, in the Aborigine's response. But his statement deserves our respect. Is his answer true or not? Well, that depends in large part on what sort of lens you are looking through. If we can break away from our hyper-individualized consciousness for a moment and realize that by touching up these paintings, the Aborigine was living a unity with his ancestors and their sense of participating in the divine, then it might be possible to understand his response. But as modern men and women, such an embrace does not come naturally to us. What is at stake here is nothing less than the nature of consciousness itself. Too often we make grand generalizations as if everything hinged merely on ideas. But as important as ideas may be, the deeper question is not just how we think, but how we perceive the world, how we relate to reality in the most visceral ways. To pursue the nature of consciousness, I am going to invoke the writings of Owen Barfield. Many of you, who many of you know, was one of C.S. Lewis's closest friends and intellectual sparring partners. So in case you think any of this Barfield stuff is really weird, but you revere Lewis, and Lewis was his best friend, to you. Because you all worship Lewis, I know that. Some people have cast doubt on the value of Barfield's work because he was a follower of Rudolf Steiner and a form of thought called anthroposophy, a school that some people find rather questionable from a theological perspective. Personally, I believe that it is possible to learn from Barfield and draw from his thought without somehow being mystically tainted by that. Lewis himself remained friends with Barfield until the end of his life. In the end, I think Barfield is simply one of the most incisive thinkers on this profoundly important subject, the nature of consciousness. Barfield once said, before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment men wore around them than a stage on which they moved. Think about that for a moment. Before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment men wore about them than a stage on which they moved. To think of yourself on a stage is already in some ways to detach yourself rather than be directly immersed in this cosmic connection with what is around you. The Aborigines' response is indicative of what Barfield calls original participation. And this consciousness is all about participation, about being a part of, living in communion with, not thinking about, not debating over, but being of one seamless connection with. The Aborigines' response, as I said, is indicative of what Barfield calls original participation, characteristic of early humanity, an unself-conscious sense of unity between observer and observed, past and present, human and divine. In his book, Saving the Appearances, Barfield notes that Greek philosophy and the religion of Israel profoundly changed the dimensions of participation. Both of these cultures pulled back from the mythic consciousness, one through reason, the other through monotheism. For example, while the golden calf would have been perfectly at home in the cave here, for Israel it became an idol. So they pulled back in one sense. But this only changed the shape of participation. For them, the discovery that God is not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire meant that he must be perceived as the mystery behind all of creation. That the Creator, in some sense, is more truly like each one of us, singular and personal. Now, this is where I know it gets really freaky. But Barfield holds that this new phase, this phase of the Judeo-Christian, classical synthesis of the early years of the church and up through the Middle Ages, he holds that this phase, far from eliminating participation and making us just analytical and abstract, made it more inward. The synthesis of Greek reason and Hebrew monotheism in the Christian era, both stressing the need for human participation in the divine order through prayer and contemplation, continued all the way through the Middle Ages. But with the scientific revolution, man separated himself from nature and embraced an abstract way of thinking. The modern West, Barfield says, exchanged meaning for literalism, turning the things of this world from signs of sacred presence into idols. So for Barfield, modern scientism is a kind of new paganism that turns the world into an idol. Creation becomes a series of objects which are operated like a machine. He illustrates this by saying that the knowledge we have today is like a clever child who's put inside an automobile. If he plays around with the instruments long enough and there's guardrails around the parking lot, he's going to be able to figure out how to drive that car. But he will only have dashboard knowledge, not true knowledge of the car. He'll know how to work it. He won't know the thing itself. Now, this story could be taken as nothing more than a narrative of decline. In the olden days, there was this beautiful original participation, this unity between the human and the cosmos. Then they lost it. Boo-hoo. But Barfield does not believe that our post-Enlightenment condition means that we are permanently exiled from participation. While we no longer have access to original participation, Barfield holds that even as modern, self-conscious individuals, we can still experience what he calls final participation. This is where art and religion, I'm going to put those in scare quotes again, art and religion return. Because for Barfield, final participation comes through the creation of metaphor. He's particularly interested in the Romantics, who sought to move beyond the mechanistic deism of the 18th century and reconnect to nature as an organic unity. Ultimately, he felt Romanticism fell short of its goal, ending up more as sentimental pantheism, rather than reaching that place of final participation. But he admired their struggle. In particular, he admired the thought of Coleridge. Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley tend to get all the press, but if you're interested in Romanticism, Coleridge is kind of an underappreciated guy, brilliant thinker. Barfield's opinion was shared by C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. You've heard of those guys, right? So are we in familiar territory again? Because guess what, people? Lewis and Tolkien engaged in the very same struggle to redeem Romanticism by grounding it in a more traditional theology. What is Narnia? What is Middle-earth? But a place where people have not fallen away from original participation. Evil in Middle-earth takes the form of the destruction of nature and the attempt to use nature rather than cooperate or participate in it. Think of Eustace Scrubb, who's the modern educated boy, so in the modern consciousness where everything is utilitarian, where everything is dashboard knowledge, and he comes into Narnia and he's surrounded by beings that take for granted a direct final participation with the divine. He doesn't understand until his butt gets kicked, gets turned into a dragon, starts scratching. Anyway, it gets better. than that. But you know that story already. Now, here's somebody who dealt with this, in my opinion, at an even deeper level. And I hope you've heard of her too, and maybe get to study some of her stories. That's Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor understood this at an even deeper level. Near the end of her novel, Wise Blood, the protagonist, Hazel Motes, goes through a very serious, life-changing transformation. He starts off the book as an arrogant nihilist. He becomes a street corner evangelist, except that in this novel, Wise Blood, he's preaching the Church of Christ without Christ. In other words, he's a cynic, he's a nihilist. He's preaching disillusionment, disenchantment. You think the world is full of meaning? You're wrong. The world is full of nothing. It's not meaningful. Wise up. Follow me, and I will show you that nothing means anything. But his arrogant nihilism has been shocked out of his system through an experience of traumatic humiliation. Chastened, he begins a series of penitential exercises to the horror of his landlady, Mrs. Flood. He does stuff like put barbed wire around his chest and put stones in his shoes. Catch the biblical reference there? Increasingly disturbed by Hazel's acts of penance, Mrs. Flood worries that he's become like a monk in a monkery. This offends Mrs. Flood's enlightened view of the world. She liked the clear light of day. She liked to see things. But Hazel, who once preached against the possibility of participation, now presents her with a mystery she cannot fathom. Now here's the description by O'Connor of what Mrs. Flood is thinking, trying to understand this crazed nihilist preacher turned mysterious penitent. Here's how it goes. She could not make up her mind what would be inside his head and what out. She thought of her own head as a switch box, which she controlled from. But with him, she could only imagine the outside in. The whole black world in his head, and his head bigger than the world. His head big enough to include the sky and planets and whatever was or had been or would be. How would he know if time were going backwards or forwards, or if he was going with it? She imagined it was like you were walking in a tunnel, and all you could see was a pinpoint of light. She had to imagine that pinpoint of light. She couldn't think of it at all without that. She saw it as some kind of a star, like the star on Christmas cards. She saw him going backwards to Bethlehem, and she had to laugh. I love that phrase. She saw him going backwards to Bethlehem, and she had to laugh. She laughs, of course, because she scorns that notion, going back to Bethlehem, going back to that child, going back to that belief that the infinite, omnipotent, almighty could be contained in the powerless, helpless babe. That belief is a form of participation, as I've been talking about. It's not an abstract proposition. It's a form of participation. Now here's the thing. Because we live in time, and because we are creatures of our time and our culture, the truth is that a lot of us, frankly, whether we realize it or not, believe that we are switch boxes in a brain operating the machinery. Just as a default. It's the default way that we think of ourselves. That's the picture of the world that we've been presented with. Man as complex machine. Brain as computer software. That's the world we inherit. But the world of objects, the world of mechanism, the dashboard knowledge that has us all speeding around in circles is hollow at the core, a desecrated altar, an abomination of desolation. But our consolation is that the altar can be reconsecrated. We can go back and enter the cave. As you've all figured out by now, the cave became the cathedral. Both are dark places whose walls and windows are covered by sacred images. And no doubt there was music in the cave, as we know there certainly was in the cathedral. The same human impulse to retreat into this womb of fertile darkness persists, even if, in my opinion, our places of worship these days are far too blindingly bright. But that's a whole nother debate. The altar is a place where life and death meet, where permeability and fluidity can still be experienced. Those phrases come from that documentary, from the interview with the man the anthropologist who said that to the ancient man who made those cave paintings, I and the cave lion, or I and the god, might interchange places. There was fluidity and permeability. And again, it's very easy to say, oh, spooky, weird, gross. On the other hand, we talk about Jesus Christ being God and man. That insight, now 2,000 years old, is an insight that comes out of original participation. And if we try to use the language of modern scientific abstractions to understand that concept, we're taking the wrong tool to the thing itself. As one student of Barfield has written, the tender shoot of final participation has from the first been acknowledged and protected by the Church in the institution of the Eucharist. For all who partake of the Eucharist first acknowledged that the man who was born in Bethlehem was of one substance with the Father, that all things were made by him. And then they take that substance into themselves, together with its representations named bread and wine. This is, after all, the heart of the matter. There was no difficulty in understanding it, as long as enough of the old participating consciousness survived. But by the physical act of communion as such, men can not only take the divine substance, the name apart directly into the unconscious part of themselves by way of their blood. The Eucharist now is the highest place where we can experience final participation, a unity between ourselves and the created order, a connectedness, not a dividedness, not an abstraction, not a thinking about the world, but an unselfconscious, immediate participation in the divine. Another aspect, and I'm nearly done, so you're all superheroes. Another aspect of the participating consciousness, that Barfield puts it, is that it cannot ultimately be experienced individually and solipsistically, but in fact is a communal experience. Just as words must be shared, spoken between at least two people to be truly part of a language, to truly convey meaning. Participation as a communal experience makes it possible to understand not only how we corporately inherit the wound of original sin, but also how we partake all in the redemption of Christ. How can our art become a form of final participation? When it is Eucharistic, sacramental. The whole world in our heads and our heads bigger than the world. Here in conclusion, I would just want to briefly draw upon the thought of the poet Scott Cairns, who has championed what he calls sacramental poetics. So this is about how art helps us. We have the Eucharist, we have the church, but art is this other zone that can help us toward a unity with creation again. Cairns' concern is that much of contemporary art and literature have become static references to past experiences, something that happened in the past away from the present. The poem just simply points you to what happened. It's a nice little memory of what happened. For Cairns, that's missing the point. That's missing what art should do. Instead, he proposes that the poetic is an occasion of immediate and observed, which is to say, presence. So art should not be about something we're just happened some time ago and we're just writing a journalistic report of it. Art, the work of art, should contain the presence of the things spoken about. It is an occasion of ongoing, generative agency. In other words, the artwork in the moment of your encounter with it creates new meaning, new knowledge. Moreover, he says, we are by that agency changed, made more like him, either the artist or the creator in the Eucharist, bearing, as we do now, his creative and recreative energies in our sanctified persons. He says this exemplifies what he calls the poetic, the presence and activity of inexhaustible, indeterminate enormity, apprehended in a discrete place. The infinite in a single image. Cairns goes on to say that, like the Eucharist, the poetic is concerned more with making something with and of the observer than they are concerned with referring her to a past event, to a proposition, or to any previously discovered matter. So in other words, if a work of art is sacramental, it's creating meaning in the moment of your encounter with it. It's not just dumping some previously known thing, gussied up in language, and just emptying it into your head. There's something happening at the moment of encounter. And of course, for Cairns, that is like the Eucharist. For him, he's Eastern Orthodox, so he believes that the real presence is present, that it's not just a memorial. So he's using his theology of the Eucharist to talk about what poetry or art does. Like the Holy Mysteries, he concludes, Holy Mysteries of the Eucharist, then the poetic is involved in communication. Not, however, in the sense that the word has become misunderstood as the one-directional distribution of information. Rather, in the sense that something of each communicant meaning the receiver of the work as well as the maker of the work, in the sense that something of each communicant is imparted to the other, and necessarily in the sense that new creation is the result. In other words, God is imparted to us in the Eucharist, and our sacrifice of ourselves in humility is imparted to him. We participate in one another when we eat his flesh and drink his blood. Okay, so I know it's freaky, crazy stuff. And I'm way in over my head, but I think it's fascinating. And I think, ideally when you confront something like this, you at least say to yourself, it's way over my head, but it's cool. And that's just kind of my way of looking at it. Now let me just finish by reading you one of Scott Cairns' poems. It's a poem that I believe, if you look at the way he uses language in this poem, and you can hardly get it from just one reading, but you'll probably at least sense it. He's using words there are a lot of puns here, not like hokey puns, but kind of deep puns. And he's using language in an active way, a way that has agency, that you as the reader can interact with as if it was a sacrament, and not just, he's just telling you a story of what happened once upon a time. But something electrical has happened when we interact with a poem written this powerfully, with this much agency. And the poem I'm going to read, he wrote a series of poems based on Greek words in the New Testament. He called them Adventures in New Testament Greek, because he's partly being satirical about the way we've lost the deeper meaning of the Greek words from the New Testament, the way we've just reduced them to simple categories. And this is the word called nous, N-O-U-S, which has often been translated as reason. It's very similar to the word logos, reason, or the mind. That's the way we think of it. We think of it as mind. Now, if you followed me at all, what is participation? Is it just the mind working? No, it's the whole of ourselves, mind, body, matter, heart, head, in the world. So if we think of the word in the New Testament as just mind, we're already exemplifying that modern consciousness. So here's this poem. It's about how the heart needs to balance the head. You could almost think the word synonymous with mind, given our so far narrow history and the excessive esteem in which we have been led to hold what is, in this case, our rightly designated nervous system. Little wonder then that some presume the mind itself both part and parcel of the person, the very seat of soul, and lately crucible for a host of chemical incentives, combinations of which can pretty much answer for most of our habits and for our affections. When even the handy lexicon cannot quite place the nous as anything beyond one rustic ancestor of reason, you might be satisfied to trouble the odd term no further, and so would fail to find your way to it. Most fruitful faculty untried, dormant in its roaring cave, the heart's intellective aptitude grows dim unless you find a way to wake it. So, let's try something even now. Even as you tend these lines, attend for a moment to your breath as you draw it in. Regard the breath's cool descent, a stream from mouth to throat to the furnace of the heart. Observe that queer, cool confluence of breath and blood, and do your thinking there. A life of participation, however fitfully experienced, is still possible for us, albeit through discipline and effort. We can go back into the darkness of the cave and offer up our broken recreations of the world on an altar, and know that the broken, sacrificed God will meet us there. We can walk backward to Bethlehem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. That gives us a lot of great things to think about and to talk about together. We have a few minutes left for questions. I will ask a first question while you formulate yours. When you do ask a question, would you please stand and speak loudly, and maybe Greg, you could repeat the question so we could all hear that as well. Near the end, you alluded to something I wanted to hear throughout, and that's the role of communal making of meaning, how we make meaning together, and that. Could you talk about, certainly the idea of the scientific revolution, one thing that does also is a focus on individualism. How can the idea of making meaning together in art also broaden our scope of that understanding?
By the way, your professor should all give you like double extra credit for coming in enduring all this stuff, so you guys really are great. Well, when you get stuff like the modern Cartesian man, you get this sense of we have to start with doubt. We can't trust what we see and feel. There's no such thing as participation. All there is the steady building up of scientifically verifiable empirical knowledge. And when you've made that statement, you have to start from the local. You have to start from this isolated node. So the very notion of modern thought is individualistic in its essence. And the classical form of thought, even in the pagan classicism, was much more communal. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys study Greek tragedy, but Greek tragedies were communal experiences, and Aristotle talked about what happens in Greek tragedy. It's a public experience. It's the community experiences together. And without their experience of it together, it's an incomplete phenomenon. It's not just entertainment. It is an action that has agency only because they are all participating. So the modern world makes us these isolated, people with a black switch box in our brain. We can be earnest, sincere Christians and very traditional conservative people, and still this is just part of the air that we breathe. And that individualism is really hurting us as a people, as a church. Scott Cairns is also, he ties his sacramental poetics into his understanding of salvation. I don't know how many of you have read Brothers Karamazov, but the monk, Father Zosima, in that book, talks about how no one should be thinking of their salvation as just my personal salvation. Again, this goes so much against our training. We're all told that I should be thinking about my salvation. Father Zosima says, all are responsible for all. Now, that may be in Russian Orthodox theology that you might want to disagree with, but if I was you, I would at least give it a hearing and kind of try to find out what he means by that. But the notion that we are looking out only for ourselves, Cairns says, diminishes our sense of connectedness to others, our sense of responsibility to others, and traps us in this kind of loneliness. And we just become used to that loneliness, and that loneliness triggers neurosis and alienation. It hurts us. It takes a psychic toll on us. So, yeah, I think that we talk about the communal, and we look at, we read people like Wendell Berry. I don't know if any of you guys have read Wendell Berry, but he writes about the land and the local community. And that's half the equation, is how to live, how to do practices that bring us together. But we also need to have a kind of metaphysics or a way of approaching the universe that parallels the practices, so that they together help us to encounter one another as one body, which we talk about in the faith and we quote in Scripture all the time, but we rarely really experience one body.
Light became, music became, we were
I don't, because that's one of my embarrassing gaps in my reading knowledge. Would you be willing to share a few thoughts? Beautiful. Well, that's a good question. It seems to indicate that the fall of man is the loss of participation rather than Adam and Eve's original sin. And this is one place where people get all freaky about Barfield because they don't. Is he Christian? He writes about Christ all the time. Is he really a Christian or is really not? I don't believe that the two are mutually exclusive. I believe in some sense that what Barfield would say is that original sin has been a movement in us that not only means that we behave wrongly toward ourselves and towards our Creator, but has always been pushing us in this direction of solipsism of the self. I don't think he believes that, that the fall from original participation was itself equivalent of sin. Walker Percy has an interesting theory, the great novelist Walker Percy has an interesting theory that maybe is a little closer to an orthodox formulation. He talks about how the discovery of what he calls triadic thought, which is sign, signifier, but meaning. So there's me and there's the signifier, but there's my ability to see the meaning of it rather than that abstraction brings about self-consciousness, and that self-consciousness is a kind of fall. But that's not to say that human beings were not sinful. But I mean, those of us who care about our faith tradition will want to point to modernity as a real problem, as a real turning point, but hopefully not one that we try to impose as the real fall. I do. In fact, one of the cool things about working in the art and faith world is that I've seen more real ecumenism in the art and faith world than I have in all the official commissions and, church bodies that have studied it, because people come together in this world of imagination which provides a kind of safe space. It's not immediately defined by dogma and church rules, but by the space in which the imagination brings us together. And it's crazy. I mean, we've got evangelicals talking about sacramentalism. We've got Catholics talking about scripture. I mean, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Sorry, that was a quote from Ghostbusters. I really think that there is a lot of movement. Now, I'm not saying that the boundaries are meaningless, but I think that different traditions are actively trying to learn from one another. And many people have said, I think quite rightly, as a Protestant, I should not feel like the first 1,500 years of the church are not mine as well. You know what I'm saying? the notion that those first 1,500 years are like cut off from me, who said that? Nobody said that. And so I find that there's a lot of interest. I'm not saying there aren't still real, genuine theological differences, but there's interesting conversation. And if we can work a little back closer to one another, I only believe that gladdens the heart of our Lord.
Thank you again, Greg, and thank you all for coming. Let's